The storm had raged for 2 days straight, a ferocious tempest that battered our small coastal town without mercy. By the time it finally passed, the beach was littered with the remnants of the sea, driftwood, seaweed, and the odd bits of debris that the ocean had spat back onto the shore. As a fisherman, I was no stranger to storms. They were part of life here, and after each one, we'd comb the beaches, hoping to find something of value washed up in the chaos. That morning, as the first light of dawn peeked over the horizon, I set out along the beach, my boots sinking into the wet sand. The air was still thick with the scent of salt and sea, and the waves lapped gently at the shore, as if apologizing for the violence of the night before. I had walked for nearly an hour, picking through the usual debris, when something caught my eye. It was half buried in the sand, a glint of metal and wood catching the early morning light. Curious, I knelt down and began to dig it out, my hands brushing away the wet sand. What I uncovered was an old fishing rod, unlike any I had ever seen. The handle was made of dark, polished wood, intricately carved with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an inner light. The reel was an ornate piece of metalwork, its gears and cogs gleaming as if they had been newly forged. Despite the rod's obvious age, it felt powerful, almost alive, as if it were thrumming with energy. I held it in my hands, marveling at its craftsmanship. There was something captivating about it, something that made it impossible to look away. My heart raced with a strange excitement as I ran my fingers over the carvings, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the weight of the reel. I should have left it there, should have walked away, but the thought never even crossed my mind. The rod felt like it belonged to me, like it had been waiting for me. That day, I decided to take it out on the water. My boat, an old but reliable vessel, rocked gently as I set off into the calm sea. The storm had cleared, and the water was still and quiet, the perfect conditions for fishing. As I cast the line, the rod seemed to hum in my hands, vibrating with an energy that sent a thrill down my spine. Within minutes, I had my first catch. The line went taut, the rod bending as something powerful pulled at the other end. I fought against it, the reel spinning furiously as I struggled to bring the fish in. It was a battle, but eventually I managed to haul it aboard. My breath caught in my throat as I stared down at the fish. It was enormous, easily the largest I had ever caught. Its scales shimmered with an iridescent light, and its eyes, black and unblinking, seemed to bore into my soul. I should have been overjoyed, but something about the fish unsettled me. Its sheer size, the unnatural gleam in its eyes, it didn't feel right, but the thrill of the catch overrode my unease, and I cast the line again. That day, I caught more fish than I ever had in a single outing. Each one was bigger than the last, more beautiful and strange than anything I had ever seen. By the time I returned to shore, my boat was nearly overflowing with the day's haul. The other fishermen stared in awe as I docked, their eyes wide with disbelief. "What's your secret, John?" One of them called out. "Never seen a catch like that." I just shrugged, not wanting to reveal the rod's strange power. I didn't fully understand it myself, but I knew it was something special, something that could change my life. Over the next few days, I continued to fish with the rod, and each time the results were the same massive otherworldly fish that filled my boat to the brim. I sold them at the market, earning more money than I ever had before. My reputation as the best fisherman in town grew, and with it my pride. But with each catch, something strange began to happen. It started with a small, dark spot on the back of my hand. At first, I thought it was just a bruise, but it didn't fade. Instead, it grew darker, spreading like a stain across my skin. More spots appeared, first on my hands, then on my arms and chest. They were cold to the touch, like patches of dead flesh, and no matter what I did, they wouldn't go away. At the same time, I began to have visions. They came at night, in the space between sleep and wakefulness, when the mind is most vulnerable. I would see a vast, dark sea stretching out before me, its waters black and endless, roiling with unseen horrors. From the depths, monstrous creatures would rise, things with too many eyes, too many limbs, their mouths filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. They would stare at me, unblinking, as if waiting for something. I woke each time in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the taste of salt and blood in my mouth. But as terrifying as the visions were, I couldn't stop fishing with the rod. It had become an obsession, a need that gnawed at me day and night. The rod's power was intoxicating, and I craved the success it brought, even as the dark spots on my skin multiplied and the visions grew more vivid. One night, after a particularly successful day on the water, I had a dream unlike any of the others. In it, I stood on the deck of my boat, alone in the middle of that endless dark sea. The water was calm, but I could feel something stirring beneath the surface, something vast and ancient. As I stared out at the horizon, a figure began to rise from the water. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were as black as the deepest ocean. He was draped in tattered robes that billowed around him like smoke, and as he emerged from the water, I could see that he was impossibly tall, his head nearly touching the clouds. He spoke without moving his lips, his voice echoing in my mind. "You have tasted power, but there is more to be had, much more. What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "I want what you desire, power, wealth, success. I can give you these things, but in return you must give me something precious." I didn't understand what he meant, but before I could ask, the dream began to fade, and I woke up, gasping for breath. The taste of salt was strong in my mouth, and my skin was cold, slick with sweat. But when I looked down at my hands, I saw that the dark spots had spread even further, covering nearly half my body. I should have been horrified, but instead, all I could think about was the power the figure had promised. I knew I should stop, should throw the rod back into the sea and never fish with it again, but I couldn't. The need was too strong, the lure of power too great. The next day I went out to sea as usual. The rod hummed in my hands, and I cast the line with a sense of purpose, of destiny. The fish came easily, more massive and grotesque than ever before. By the time I returned to shore, I was exhausted but satisfied. But when I got home, I found something that made my blood run cold. My wife Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at me with hollow eyes, and I saw that her skin had taken on a sickly pallor, her once vibrant hair now dull and lifeless. "John," she whispered, her voice weak, "I don't feel well." I rushed to her side, but as I touched her hand, I felt the coldness of her skin, the same coldness that had spread across my own body. Panic surged through me as I realized what was happening. The figure from my dream had taken his payment, my wife's life force. Over the next few days, Emily grew weaker, her body wasting away before my eyes. No doctor could explain it, and no medicine could help. At the same time, my catches grew larger and more twisted, the fish now monstrous in appearance, with bulging eyes and gaping mouths filled with razor-sharp teeth. But the price for my success was steep. Not just Emily, but my son and daughter began to show the same symptoms: pale skin, lifeless eyes, their vitality draining away as if something was feeding on them. And I knew, deep down, that it was my fault. The rod, the power, the visions, it was all connected. One night, as I sat by Emily's bedside, watching her struggle for breath, the figure from my dream appeared again. This time he spoke aloud, his voice a low, guttural rumble. "You have gained much, but at what cost? Take it back," I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. "I don't want any of it. Just give me back my family." He shook his head, his expression devoid of pity. "Once the bargain is struck, it cannot be undone. But perhaps you can save them." "How?" I demanded, desperate. "Return the rod to the sea. It is not meant for mortal hands. Do this, and I may spare them." Without another word, he vanished, leaving me alone in the dark room, the sound of Emily's labored breathing filling the silence. I knew what I had to do. The next morning I took the rod and went out to the deepest part of the sea. The sky was overcast, the water choppy, but I didn't care. I rowed until I could no longer see the shore, until I was alone in the vast expanse of water. With a deep breath, I stood at the edge of the boat and hurled the rod into the sea. It sank quickly, disappearing into the dark depths without a trace. As it vanished, I felt a sudden release, as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I returned home, praying that it wasn't too late, but when I walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. The house was too quiet, too still. I rushed to the bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest, and found Emily lying in bed, her eyes closed, her skin pale and cold. She was gone. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, and ran to the children's room. But they too were gone, their small bodies lying still and lifeless in their beds. The figure had lied. I had returned the rod, but my family was gone, their lives drained away by the very power I had sought. And now I was alone, cursed to live with the knowledge that my greed had killed the ones I loved. I left the town that night, unable to bear the weight of my guilt. The storm came again, a violent tempest that lashed at the coast, but I welcomed it. I walked into the sea, the waves crashing around me, pulling me deeper and deeper into the black water, and as the cold darkness closed in around me, I saw the figure one last time, his black eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Power always comes with a price," he whispered, his voice echoing in the depths. Then the sea swallowed me whole. When the fish began to disappear from our lake, the entire village was thrown into a panic. For generations, the lake had provided for us, its waters teeming with bass, trout, and catfish. It was our lifeblood, the reason our small village had survived through famine, war, and the relentless march of time. But now the nets were coming up empty, and the few fish we did catch were sickly and thin, their eyes clouded, their scales dull. At first, we thought it was just a bad season, but as the days turned into weeks and then months, it became clear that something was very wrong. The elders, those who had lived through more hardships than most, began to whisper about the old stories, the ones they had told us as children to keep us from wandering too far into the lake. They spoke of the lake's cursed center, a place where the water was always warm, even in the dead of winter, and where the fish that swam too close were never seen again. But we were desperate. We had no choice but to venture out further, into the deeper parts of the lake that we had always avoided. There was no other way. Without the fish we would starve. I was one of the younger fishermen, barely 20, but with a wife and a child to feed, I couldn't afford to be afraid. The village depended on us, on the few brave souls who were willing to defy the old warnings and venture into the unknown. Each morning, we would set out in our small boats, rowing further and further from shore, our hearts heavy with the knowledge that we were pushing our luck. One day, after weeks of fruitless fishing, I decided to go even farther than anyone had before. The other fishermen looked at me with a mixture of admiration and fear as I set out alone, my boat cutting through the still waters of the lake. I didn't tell my wife, Lena, where I was going. I didn't want to worry her more than she already was. The morning was gray, the sky overcast, as I rowed towards the center of the lake. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, but the water was unnaturally calm, almost as if it were holding its breath. I had brought enough supplies to last a few days, determined to find something, anything, that would keep my family fed. But as I rowed, a strange unease settled over me, a feeling that I was being watched. After hours of rowing, I reached a part of the lake that was unfamiliar, even to me. The water here was different, darker, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. The temperature began to rise, the air growing thick and humid, and the water took on a reddish hue, as though it had been stained with blood. I slowed my rowing, glancing around nervously, but there was no one else in sight. I was completely alone. That's when I saw it, a hidden cove, nestled between two jagged cliffs that jutted out from the shore like the teeth of some great beast. The water here was even warmer, almost hot to the touch, and the red tint was more pronounced, swirling in the water like dye. My heart pounded in my chest as I steered my boat into the cove, unable to shake the feeling that I was trespassing on forbidden ground. As I reached the center of the cove, I decided to cast my line. The air was still, the only sound the soft lapping of water against the side of the boat. I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead, my hands trembling as I baited the hook and cast it into the blood-red water. For a long time, nothing happened. The line hung limply in the water, and I began to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. But just as I was about to reel it in, the line went taut, almost yanking the rod from my hands. My heart leaped with excitement, and I began to reel in the line, struggling against whatever was on the other end. But as I pulled, the water around the boat began to ripple and boil, steam rising from the surface. I froze, staring down at the water in horror as shapes began to form beneath the surface. At first they were just dark shadows, indistinct and formless. But as they drew closer, I saw that they were figures people, reaching up towards the surface with skeletal hands. I recognized them. They were the villagers who had disappeared over the years, the ones who had gone out on the lake and never returned. Their faces were twisted in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror and pain, their mouths open as if they were crying out for help. Their bodies were bloated and decayed, their skin pale and wrinkled, like the fish we had been catching. And they were reaching for me. Panic surged through me as I realized what was happening. The line in my hands was no longer pulling, it was being pulled, drawn towards the figures beneath the surface. I tried to let go, to drop the rod and row away, but my hands wouldn't obey. It was as if they were frozen in place, locked in a death grip around the rod. The figures were getting closer now, their hands breaking the surface of the water, reaching for the boat, for me. I could see their faces clearly, the faces of friends and neighbors, people I had known my entire life, now twisted into grotesque masks of horror. They clawed at the boat, their fingers scraping against the wood, trying to pull themselves up. And then, with a sudden jerk, I was pulled forward, the boat lurching as the line was yanked from my hands. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, and watched in terror as the figures dragged the line down into the depths. Their mouths still open in those silent screams. The water around the boat began to churn, and I knew I had to get out of there. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the oars and rowing as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. But the water was working against me, pulling me back towards the center of the cove, towards the figures that had once been my friends. The chanting started then, a low guttural sound that seemed to rise from the very depths of the lake. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but it filled me with a deep primal fear. The water boiled and frothed, and I could feel the heat rising, burning my skin as I rowed with all my strength. But it was no use. The boat was being pulled back, drawn towards the center of the cove, where the water was now bubbling violently. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and I could see the figures rising up from the water, their hands reaching out to me. I let out a scream, a raw, desperate sound, and tried to jump from the boat, but something caught my leg, one of the hands, cold and clammy, dragging me down. I kicked and thrashed, but more hands joined it, pulling me into the water, into the boiling, churning depths. The last thing I saw before the water closed over my head was the face of Lena, her eyes wide with horror as she reached out to me, her mouth open in a silent scream. Then the water claimed me. It was like being plunged into a furnace, the heat searing my skin, boiling the blood in my veins. The chanting filled my ears, drowning out my own screams, as I was dragged deeper and deeper into the abyss. The figures surrounded me, their faces twisted with anger and pain, their hands clawing at me, tearing at my flesh. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, the chanting stopped. The water was still, the figures gone. I was alone, floating in the darkness, my body broken and burned, my mind teetering on the edge of madness. I tried to breathe, but the water filled my lungs, choking me, drowning me. But I didn't die. I was trapped, suspended in the water, my body no longer my own. I could feel the others around me, their presence cold and oppressive, their minds filled with the same despair and rage that now consumed me. We were one, bound together by the curse of the lake, doomed to an eternity of torment, waiting for the next fool to venture too far, to cast their line into the cursed waters, and when they did, we would be waiting. I had always prided myself on being a man of reason, a man who saw the world through the lens of logic and science. Superstitions, ghost stories, and curses were for the weak-minded, the easily swayed. I had spent my life debunking myths and exposing charlatans, always with a smug sense of superiority. So when I first heard the tales about Blackwater Lake, I couldn't help but scoff. The stories had become the stuff of local legend. Once Blackwater Lake was a haven for fishermen, renowned for its abundance of bass and trout. But over the past decade, it had gained a far more sinister reputation. They said that anyone who fished there after dusk would never return, and those who were found were horribly disfigured, their bodies bloated and pale, their eyes wide open in terror. I arrived in the small town of Willow Creek, determined to put an end to the nonsense. The locals eyed me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion as I checked into the only motel. The old woman behind the desk, a frail creature with skin like parchment, looked up at me from under her thick glasses and said, "You're here for the lake, aren't you?" "Yes," I replied, setting my bag on the counter. "I'm going to prove that all this talk of curses and deaths is nothing more than overactive imaginations." She frowned, her lips tightening into a thin line. "You'd be wise to leave it alone. Blackwater Lake has taken enough souls. It don't need yours too." I forced a laugh, though her words left a strange unease in the pit of my stomach. "I'm not afraid of fairy tales, ma'am." Her gaze held mine for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she handed me the key to my room. "Just remember what I said. Some things are better left alone." I brushed off her warning, as I had with so many others before it, and spent the rest of the day clearing my gear and asking questions around town. The responses were all the same. People warned me against going to the lake after dark, some even pleading with me to leave it be. But I was stubborn, and the more they tried to dissuade me, the more determined I became. By the time dusk began to settle over the horizon, I was on my way to the lake, my fishing rod and tackle box in the trunk of my car. The road wound through dense woods, the trees closing in around me like the bars of a cage. I had a map, but it did little to quell the growing sense of unease. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the very air was thick with something unseen, something malevolent. When I finally reached the lake, the sun had dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the water. Blackwater Lake lived up to its name. The water was an inky black, its surface so still it looked like glass. I stood on the shore for a moment, staring out at it, and felt a shiver run down my spine. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the cool evening air, and set to work. I launched my small boat, an old but sturdy vessel I had borrowed from a reluctant local, and rowed out to the center of the lake. The water was eerily calm, not a ripple disturbing its surface, and the only sound was the soft creaking of the oars in their locks. As I reached the middle, I set the oars down and prepared my line, casting it into the black depths with practiced ease. For a while there was nothing, just the quiet lapping of the water against the boat and the occasional hoot of an owl from the surrounding forest. I settled back, waiting for a bite, my skepticism still intact. But as the last light of day faded, something changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air turning cold and clammy. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, frowning as I noticed a strange, unnatural chill in the air. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that made you feel like something was watching you. Then the water began to ripple. At first it was just a slight disturbance, so small I thought it was my imagination, but then the ripples grew, spreading out from the center of the lake in perfect concentric circles. I looked around, expecting to see a fish or a bird, but there was nothing. No wind, no movement, just those ripples, growing larger and more violent. My heart began to race as I realized the boat was moving, being pulled slowly but steadily towards the center of the lake. I grabbed the oars, trying to row back to shore, but the water seemed to resist me, as if something beneath the surface was holding me in place. Panic set in as I watched the water around the boat churn and bubble. Then, to my horror, something emerged from the depths. Black tendrils, like twisted, slimy vines, rose up from the water, wrapping themselves around the boat. They were cold and slick, and the touch of them made my skin crawl. I tried to pull them off, but they were too strong, too numerous. They coiled around the oars, snapping them in half, and then they began to pull. I struggled, fighting against the unseen force, but it was no use. The boat was dragged towards the center of the lake, the water growing darker and darker, until it was like I was floating on a sea of ink. The tendrils tightened around the boat, and I could feel the wood creaking and groaning under the pressure. Then, as I leaned over the edge, trying to free the boat from the clutches of whatever monstrosity lay beneath, I caught sight of my reflection in the water. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. The face staring back at me wasn't my own. It was me, but horribly changed. My skin was pale and bloated, my eyes sunken and ringed with darkness. My hair was matted and wet, clinging to my skull, and my lips were blue, twisted into a grotesque grin. I recoiled, but the reflection moved with me, mimicking my every action, its eyes locking onto mine with a malevolent glee. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night, by the black water that was now lapping over the sides of the boat. The tendrils tightened, pulling me closer to the water's surface, and I could feel the cold seeping into my flesh, numbing my limbs. Desperate, I tried to stand, to fight, but the boat tipped violently, throwing me off balance. I plunged into the water, the cold hitting me like 1,000 needles. I struggled to swim to break the surface, but the tendrils wrapped around my legs, pulling me down into the abyss. As I was dragged deeper, I saw them, other faces in the water, twisted and decayed, their mouths open in silent screams. They were the faces of the ones who had come before me, the fishermen who had dared to challenge the curse. Their eyes were empty, their bodies bloated and misshapen, and they reached out to me with skeletal hands, pulling me further into the dark. I thrashed and fought, but it was useless. The water filled my lungs, the blackness closing in around me. I could feel the life being drained from me, the cold seeping into my very soul. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw was my own reflection, grinning back at me with that ghastly, decaying face. Then everything went black. When they found my body a week later, washed up on the shore, it was as pale and bloated as the others. My eyes were wide open, frozen in a final moment of terror, and my lips were twisted into that same grotesque grin. The locals shook their heads and muttered about the curse of Blackwater Lake, but I was beyond caring. My soul was trapped in that dark, watery abyss, just like all the others before me. Blackwater Lake had claimed another victim,